On May 10, 2026, the Vatican press room was already full when Pope Leo XIV walked toward the podium without notes. He placed nothing on the lectern, offered no greeting, and stood in silence for 7 seconds while cameras from around the world remained fixed on him. 5 popes had protected the same secret for 63 years, each one convinced that disclosure would damage the institution more than silence ever could. Leo had reached the opposite conclusion. When he finally spoke, he did not begin with doctrine, diplomacy, or defense. He said that church-linked money had passed through political operations connected to documented human rights abuses in Guatemala, the Philippines, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then he delivered the sentence that changed the room. Silence had not protected the Church. Silence had made it complicit. The question was no longer whether the Vatican had known, but why 5 popes had chosen not to speak, and why this pope had decided that the cost of truth was finally lower than the cost of hiding it. The system began long before Pope Leo XIV entered the Vatican press room. In 1963, during the papacy of Paul VI, a file was placed under an unwritten restriction known inside the article as pontifical silence. It was not a category published in canon law, and it did not appear in any public Vatican regulation. It functioned through private agreement between the Pope and a small circle of senior advisors who believed that certain disclosures could endanger the institution itself. The contents were not presented as a threat to Catholic doctrine. They threatened the credibility, diplomacy, and moral authority of the Holy See. Inside were records of secret accounts, private agreements, and financial transfers, connecting Vatican-linked channels to political operations across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Funds described publicly as missionary assistance or humanitarian support had, in some cases, been redirected to influence elections, strengthen regimes, and assist the suppression of democratic movements. The network was not limited to one government, one continent, or one moment of crisis. It had become structural, moving through systems that allowed religious funding, diplomatic access, and political influence to overlap without public scrutiny. At least 2 documented cases involved money-reaching operations used against democratic opposition. The danger inside the file was therefore not one isolated scandal, but evidence that the institution had repeatedly allowed its financial machinery to serve political objectives. Paul VI understood what exposure could do. According to the source, he concluded that publication would destroy the Church's moral authority at a moment when the Vatican still depended on that authority to operate across borders and governments. He sealed the material, restricted access, and allowed the system to remain beyond ordinary review. The decision protected the institution from immediate scandal, but it also transferred the responsibility to every pope who came after him. Paul VI did not destroy the file, deny its contents, or order the system dismantled. He chose containment. The records were sealed because he believed disclosure would damage the Church's moral authority more severely than the hidden financial network already had. That decision ended the immediate crisis inside the Vatican, but it ensured that the next pope would inherit both the evidence and the responsibility. In 1978, John Paul I entered the papacy with no knowledge of how little time he had. Within the first week of his pontificate, he was briefed on the sealed material and the financial operations described inside it. According to correspondence later referenced by Pope Leo XIV, his response was direct, "This must be corrected." The words suggested that he did not view silence as a permanent solution. John Paul I reigned for only 33 days. He died before he could begin a formal investigation, issue an order, or confront the officials connected to the system. The source places his briefing and his death close together, creating a question that remained attached to the file for decades. Pope Leo XIV did not claim that the two events were connected, and the article provides no evidence proving such a connection. What remained certain inside the source was simpler and more consequential. John Paul I had seen enough to believe that action was necessary, but he did not live long enough to take it. The file stayed sealed, the network survived, and the burden passed to John Paul II. Unlike his predecessor, the next pope would have decades to decide what to do. John Paul II inherited more than a sealed file. He inherited a functioning financial system that had already learned how to move money through channels protected by religious purpose and diplomatic access. During the 1980s, those channels were used to support solidarity in Poland, a movement that challenged communist rule and became central to the political transformation of Eastern Europe. That operation was defended inside the Vatican as part of a larger struggle against communism. At the same time, the same financial machinery was moving money in another direction. Vatican-linked accounts were used to support right-wing paramilitary groups in Central America, where anti-communist policy had become a justification for violence. Villages were destroyed, activists disappeared, and Catholic priests were murdered by forces connected to those campaigns. The institution that claimed to defend human dignity was now tied financially to operations that violated it. In 1986, a Jesuit investigator named Father Tomás Elgueta assembled the evidence into a detailed memorandum. He did not write in general terms. The document identified individuals, recorded financial amounts, and named people who had been killed. It transformed a pattern of suspicion into a record that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. The memorandum reached the desk of John Paul II. He read it and then met privately with Father Elgueta, away from the public schedule and outside any formal investigation. No public statement followed, and no institutional inquiry was announced. Instead, Father Elgueta was reassigned to a remote parish in northern Canada. The memorandum was placed inside the sealed archive with the earlier records. The financial channels remained active, and the officials connected to them stayed beyond public scrutiny. John Paul II had been shown the cost of the system in names, money, and bodies. He chose not to expose it, and the silence became harder for the next pope to break. When Benedict XVI became pope in 2005, the Cold War justification had disappeared, but the financial structure remained. Money now moved through real estate, shell companies, and investment arrangements that benefited certain Vatican-connected families, while parishes in developing nations struggled to remain open. The system had changed its appearance without losing its power. In 2010, Benedict ordered a partial internal audit. The auditors moved toward the restricted records, but were stopped by the Secretariat of State before they reached the sealed file. According to the source, Benedict concluded that some doors were better left closed. He resigned in 2013, and people close to him later suggested that the weight of what he knew and could not correct had contributed to his decision. Pope Francis inherited the same unresolved system and was briefed on the file in 2014. He pushed for transparency at the Vatican Bank, created new oversight bodies, and removed corrupt officials. Those reforms disrupted parts of the network, but he still refused to open the sealed records containing the oldest and most damaging evidence. According to an unnamed cardinal, Francis feared that full disclosure would create a crisis of confidence in the papacy itself. He tried to reform the institution without exposing its complete history, believing the Church might not survive the loss of trust. Francis died on April 21st, 2025, and the file remained sealed. Benedict attempted a limited investigation and stopped when the institutional barriers closed around it. Francis changed personnel and systems, but accepted that some truths might destroy the authority needed to repair the damage. Both confronted corruption, yet neither broke the silence. The burden passed to a successor formed far from the Roman system. Robert Francis Prevost did not arrive at the papacy through a career built entirely inside the Roman Curia. He was an American Augustinian who had spent years in Peru, far from the protected corridors where Vatican power was negotiated and preserved. That experience had placed him near communities marked by political violence, institutional abandonment, and the long consequences of decisions made elsewhere. When he was elected Pope on May 8, 2025, he chose the name Leo XIV. From the first week of his pontificate, his working style unsettled officials who were accustomed to slower transitions. He did not spend months building alliances before touching sensitive offices. He asked direct questions, requested access to records that new popes usually left alone, and pressed senior officials for explanations they were not prepared to give. The Curia began to understand that he was not interested in inheriting the existing balance of power. Within his first 30 days, Leo removed 2 senior financial officials. He also replaced the head of the Vatican's internal auditing office, shifting control of a department that had previously been blocked from reaching the most restricted material. These were not symbolic changes. They altered who could authorize reviews, who could delay them, and who could report directly to the Pope. The movement continued behind closed doors. Cardinals who had prospered under the old arrangement found themselves excluded from meetings that had once depended on their approval. Long-standing appointments disappeared from schedules, files were redirected, and instructions began passing through a smaller circle. The silence inside the Curia was no longer calm, it was defensive. Leo then brought in people who did not belong to the traditional Vatican network. Forensic accountants were asked to examine financial trails. Legal experts were assigned to identify institutional exposure, and a former investigator from the International Criminal Police Organization was added to the effort. Their presence made the purpose of the changes impossible to dismiss as ordinary reform. The Pope was building a team capable of following money across borders and through systems designed to resist internal scrutiny. Even Leo's closest allies did not yet know the complete object of the search. They could see officials being removed, offices being reorganized, and access routes changing, but the final target remained hidden from them. By the end of those first months, one fact had become clear inside the Vatican. The new pope was not merely correcting financial administration. He was looking for the source of something older. In January 2026, Pope Leo XIV received a letter from the family of Father Tomás Elgueta. The Jesuit investigator had died in 2019 in the remote Canadian parish where he had spent his final years. He had never spoken publicly about what he uncovered, but he had preserved copies of the evidence. After his death, his family found the material and sent it to the new pope. Leo read the entire collection in one sitting. According to a Vatican aide, he remained silent for 2 hours after reaching the final page. Then he gave a direct order: "Find me the full archive." The documents proved that Elgueta's 1986 memorandum had been only part of a much larger record. The search lasted 3 months. The files were not kept in the Vatican's ordinary historical archives, but in a reinforced chamber beneath the governorate building. Entry required a physical key held by the Cardinal Secretary of State and a code known only to the Pope. Because the previous code had died with Francis, Leo's team had to break the encryption. When the chamber opened, the investigators found 14 boxes. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, bank records, diplomatic cables, photographs, and handwritten notes by Paul VI explaining why the material had been concealed. The archive showed both the structure of the financial network and the reasoning used to protect it. Leo spent weeks reviewing the evidence. He consulted canon lawyers, historians, and advisors, but the final decision remained his alone. By May, he had seen enough to understand that silence was no longer a neutral choice. On May 10, 2026, he decided to bring the record into public view. On May 10, 2026, the Vatican press room filled with journalists from major international outlets. The press office had released only one sentence, stating that the Pope would address historical matters of institutional responsibility. No one in the room knew how far the statement would go. Pope Leo XIV entered without notes and stood at the podium in silence for 7 seconds. He then said that the Church had carried a secret for 63 years and that previous popes had treated silence as protection. Leo declared that the silence had become complicity. The statement lasted 14 minutes. He confirmed the existence of the financial network and acknowledged that church-linked money had supported political operations in several countries. He did not release every document or identify every Vatican official involved, but the admission established institutional responsibility. Leo named 3 cases: Guatemala in 1982, the Philippines in 1986, and the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1998. In each case, church-linked accounts had supported regimes or factions associated with documented human rights abuses. Vatican officials had not carried out the violence directly, but their financial channels had helped sustain the forces responsible. Leo announced a full, independent investigation and promised that its findings would be made public. He said that the Church could not ask the world for trust while refusing to trust the world with the truth. By the time he left the podium, the sealed archive was no longer an internal burden. It had become an international crisis. The reaction inside the Vatican was immediate. 3 cardinals requested emergency meetings and 2 threatened to resign, not because they disputed the corruption, but because they opposed the Pope's decision to expose it. The Secretary of State, informed only hours before the press conference, reportedly told an aide that Leo had set fire to 600 years of diplomacy. Outside the Vatican, survivors' groups and human rights organizations praised the announcement. Families of victims in Guatemala called it the first honest word they had heard from Rome. Critics accused Leo of grandstanding, damaging the Church for personal legacy, and weaponizing the past. Within 48 hours, Leo issued a papal decree creating the Commission for Historical Accountability. Its 7 members were 2 church historians, 2 forensic accountants, 1 human rights lawyer, 1 former diplomat, and 1 survivor representative. The commission received full access to the sealed records and a mandate to investigate, document, and recommend reparative action. Its findings would be released publicly rather than delivered only to the Pope. That requirement removed the protection that had allowed earlier inquiries to disappear inside the institution. Leo knew the decision could bring lawsuits, diplomatic strain, financial losses, and internal resistance. The press conference had broken the silence, but the commission ensured that the record could not be sealed again. On May 12th, 2 days after the press conference, Pope Leo XIV met privately with the College of Cardinals. The details were not officially released, but multiple accounts described a tense room and a direct challenge from Cardinal Rienzo, one of the most powerful figures in the Curia. He warned the Pope that the disclosure was placing weapons in the hands of the Church's enemies. Leo answered without hesitation. He said that the enemies were not outside the walls, but inside the files. According to one account, the room remained silent for nearly a full minute. The conflict was no longer about whether the records existed, but whether protecting the institution still justified, protecting what those records contained. Cardinal Okonkwo of Nigeria then stood and addressed the Pope. He said that his country appeared in the files and that his people had suffered because of what they revealed. He told Leo that he had waited his entire life to hear a pope speak as Leo had spoken 2 days earlier. Then he gave the Pope his full support. Other cardinals began to stand, one after another. Not all of them joined him, but enough did to create a decisive, informal vote of confidence. Leo now had the support required to continue the investigation. The opposition did not disappear, but it lost the ability to stop him openly. On May 14th, an unsigned letter circulated among senior Vatican officials. It accused Leo of violating the sacred trust of the papal office and warned that the disclosures would bring catastrophic legal and financial consequences. The language resembled the rhetoric of traditionalist factions inside the Curia. Vatican security opened an investigation, but the author was not publicly identified. At the same time, the pressure moved beyond the Vatican. The government of Guatemala formally requested access to records connected to its country, and the Philippines Human Rights Commission issued a similar demand. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, survivors' families submitted a symbolic petition to the International Criminal Court asking whether Vatican officials could face responsibility under international law. The archive had become more than a church investigation. It was now a diplomatic and legal confrontation. On May 15th, Pope Leo XIV addressed the fears spreading through the church during a homily at Santa Marta. The service was not televised, but the text was released afterward. He said that truth would not weaken the church because the lie had already done the damage, and that a wound left unnamed could not begin to heal. That same day, priests across Latin America read his words from their pulpits. In Guatemala City, a mass was held for families whose relatives had been killed during the Civil War and who had long alleged church complicity. The church was full, and people wept openly as the Pope's words were read. On May 16th, an Italian investigative website published an authentic diplomatic cable from 1983. Sent by a Vatican representative in Manila to the Secretary of State, it authorized the transfer of funds to a foundation connected to Ferdinand Marcos. Vatican officials confirmed the document within hours, forcing Leo to abandon his planned gradual release. He called a second press briefing that lasted 7 minutes. Leo confirmed that the cable was real, said it was only one of many, and ordered the commission to accelerate its work. He promised that every relevant record would be published, not because the Vatican had been forced to act, but because disclosure was right. When journalists asked who had leaked the document, Leo said he was less concerned with who shared it than with why it had been hidden. Behind the public confrontation, forensic accountants traced accounts through Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Panama. They estimated that more than $2 billion had moved through the network between 1963 and 2001, with approximately $400 million tied to operations unrelated to charity. The financial totals still did not measure the human cost. In Guatemala, church-linked funds had supported a military government blamed for the deaths of an estimated 200,000 people, most of them indigenous Maya. Vatican officials had not carried out the killings, but the source connected the institution to financial infrastructure, diplomatic cover, and moral legitimacy. By the end of May 16th, the archive was no longer a hidden record. It had become evidence the world was preparing to judge. Leo's years in Peru made the archive impossible for him to treat as an abstract Vatican problem. He had lived among communities marked by political violence, heard survivors describe their losses, and seen the consequences of decisions made far from them. The records carried names, money, and institutional responsibility, but for Leo they also carried human faces. Late on May 16th, he called the president of Guatemala. The conversation lasted 22 minutes, and Leo expressed profound sorrow and responsibility for the Church's role without using the word apology, following legal advice about possible liability. The president later said that for the first time, Guatemala felt heard by Rome. The Commission for Historical Accountability began its work, with its first public report expected within 90 days. Leo ordered the related records digitized for eventual public access and created a Vatican-funded mechanism for reparative payments to affected communities. The disclosure had moved beyond words into investigation, access, and material consequence. On May 17th, Leo visited the tomb of Pope Francis in St. Peter's Basilica and knelt there in silence. When an aide asked whether he had been praying for Francis, Leo said he had been praying for all of them. His predecessors had carried the burden, he said, but they had not been able to put it down. Paul VI feared scandal. John Paul I died before he could act. John Paul II accepted the system in pursuit of a larger political goal. Benedict XVI became overwhelmed, and Francis believed reform could happen without full exposure. Leo chose differently, knowing the decision could bring lawsuits, diplomatic conflict, financial loss, and resistance inside the Curia. 5 popes preserved the silence. One pope finally accepted the price of ending it.